CNBC Africa, in partnership with Transnet, bring you a discussion on prospects and investment opportunities in Africa's freight, transport and logistics system from the World Economic Forum on Africa, which was recently held in Rwanda Kigali. A high-profile panel sat down to discuss the opportunities and challenges the logistics sector faces on the continent. Transnet CEO Mr. Siyabonga Gama opened up the floor with an update on developments at Transnet.
The new Transnet that we need to forge is really probably a very different Transnet from the one that we have known for a very long time, largely driven by the fact that there is a fundamental and structural shift in global markets. Key to this, we've seen the commodity crunch where for a very long time Transnet had dependent largely on mining activity. Part of what we want to do going forward is to begin to diversify the pond from which we fish. Critically, you'll be aware that Transnet has been investing in the market demand strategy. Part of that has been to refleet our locomotive and wagon fleet. What that has done is to embolden Transnet in terms of Transnet's ability to serve markets that are time sensitive, which we have hitherto not been able to do because we always had very old rolling stock. We have teamed up with a number of original equipment manufacturers, chief among which is General Electric of America, the transportation division, who are working with us on diesel locomotives together with CNR of China. We've also teamed up with Bombardier Transportation as well as CSR of China on the electric side, and together we have started a 1064 program which is more than 50 billion rand to assist us in terms of modernizing and upgrading the locomotive fleet of Transnet. But as we do that, we always do it in a manner and way to make sure that our rail capacity always matches our port capacity. So there is a number of other initiatives in terms of deepening some of our berths, especially at the port of Durban. We are also upgrading the multi-product pipeline at a cost of some 27 billion rand to make sure that we keep Gauteng wet.
So Carl, let's bring you in here as Port Terminals Chief Executive. If you can build on the commentary that Sia has given on the opportunities in Africa and how you are taking hold of those opportunities and your plans for the future.
Just to build on what Sia is saying, yes, indeed we've established quite a significant presence on the continent. And when I say continent, I include the southernmost tip of Africa as well, in South Africa, where, as Sia has indicated, pursuant to our market demand strategy, we've been investing and continue to invest quite extensively in building out our network and infrastructure in South Africa, both as part of replacement of aging equipment, so that we can continue to sustain efficient services for our customers there, but also expansionary as well for attracting new business. But also beyond our borders, up the west coast, up the east coast of South Africa, we're now taking offshore the skills and capabilities that we have. And I think, as Sia has indicated, in Benin on the 10th of September last year, we signed an agreement with Sobermap for assisting them with the modernization of their port, their transfer of skills, building capacity, and also helping to deepen, I think, the capability at the port in Benin. Recently, they've even asked us now to extend the arrangement that we have with them at the berth, in other berths in Benin. Similarly, on the East Coast as well, we're looking at some major opportunities there. There's a major opportunity in Kenya, the port of Lamu, which is a major development, and we are a significant player in terms of the interest that we have in participating in that investment, and places like Tanzania as well, berth 13 and 14, which recently have been up for concession. We've expressed an interest in that as well, and in other countries as well on the continent. And this is really part and parcel of the growth and the development of Transnet, as Sia illustrated, because having established a presence and the capabilities and the skills and the growth that you see in South Africa, we're now leveraging off that and looking at how we can grow that and deepen that in assisting with the growth and delivery of services in other parts of the African continent. And as I've indicated, we've seen some successes. We obviously are interested in seeing a lot more.
Tammy, let's get you in here as Transnet Engineering Chief Executive. Perhaps you can elaborate on these successes as we build the story about how Transnet is building into Africa and what you're seeing on the ground.
Transnet Engineering, at the moment, what we are looking at, we are very strong on building supply chains, and our approach to the continent is not just to come in, supply rolling stock and go back to South Africa. We are looking at setting up local facilities and making sure that we've got supply chains that will support the running of these rolling stock for the next 20 to 30 years for the time when they are in operations. We also do training. We train at the moment about 30,000 people per annum in terms of various engineering skills, which we are used to support the fleets that we manufacture. In terms of capacity, in Transnet Engineering, we have a capacity to produce about 500 passenger coaches per annum. We can do about 400 locomotives per annum, and we've got capacity to manufacture 4,500 new wagons per annum.
So Mahan, let's bring you in, Development Bank of Southern Africa, and your focus areas outside of South Africa for the rest of the continent.
Thank you very much. We've been a partner of Transnet for a while now, including we've got an MOU signed with them around supporting them with early stage development, so we're very proud to be here. In terms of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we are owned by the South African government, and our mandate is around infrastructure. And specifically, one of the critical elements of our mandate is to promote regional integration. So how do we tie South Africa closer together with the rest of the continent for the benefit of all of its people? And one of the ways that we're doing that, especially in the transport sector, which is what we're discussing today, is through transnational corridors. And one example of which is the North-South corridor. It's one of those presidential infrastructure initiatives led by our own president, His Excellency Jacob Zuma, and it really focuses on tying South Africa more closely together with the region coming up to the Great Lakes, which is exactly where we are. Similarly, there's another one around the Central Corridor, which we've been supporting from the port of Dar es Salaam through Tanzania to the southern part of the Great Lakes as well. And the way that we do that is by providing financing, typically debt financing, but also early stage risk capital, which is a new part of the business that we've been growing as well. We've
had a lot of discussions here in Kigali already about Africa rising or falling. Where are we? And I'm going to throw in here the IMF's recent report on the sub-Saharan Africa, saying that for 2015, we saw 3% GDP growth across sub-Saharan Africa, 3.5% rather. This is forecast for 3% in 2016. Now, remember, we've been growing around about 6% for the past decade. So that is half the last decade's growth. And it's marginally above population growth in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a very real discussion that needs to be had. And Sia, this brings me to my question as to whether there is the money in Africa to invest in ports, to buy railways, and invest in all the other elements that we've heard about from the Transnet Group. So my question, is there the money in Africa?
The challenge of the continent is not so much about the availability of capital. I think, as Mohan indicates, we need to really make sure that we fast-track processes that lead to bankable feasibility studies. And that's where we've actually been quite poor in terms of developing that kind of pipeline. But the challenge really has been one of vision, and I think the African Union, in terms of looking at regional integration, has begun to assist in terms of providing the institutional context that is required, because in a lot of our countries, what you'll see is we have a lot of minerals on the ground, but the bottleneck has always been infrastructure. We are unable to trade amongst ourselves, which would increase GDP growth quite exponentially. We would move from the 3% that the IMF is talking about to probably about 9%. If we're able to debottleneck, and if we created railroads, if our ports and our customs were actually much more efficient, because our ability to trade with one another before we trade with the rest of the world. So we need to globalize the African continent itself.
And the stat there, Sia, is that intra-Africa trade sits at around 11 to 12% at the moment.
That's
so huge
correct.
Opportunity.
Yes, it's a huge opportunity, and that's why I think from a Transnet perspective, we are therefore saying, with the skills and expertise that we have, we could assist in terms of liberating quite a lot of the infrastructure projects, in terms of either advising, investing in, or in terms of operating and taking the continent to a much higher trajectory. But also importantly, using our model of partnerships that we've used in Southern Africa to partner with other countries on the continent. A lot of the people who have come to Transnet, looking at our National Command Center, looking at our world-class heavy haul operations, for instance, where we run 342 wagon trains, for instance, between Saldanha and the Northern Cape, can begin to say, how do we harness the expertise that already exists within Transnet and export it to the rest of the continent, so that we're able to then say, if we were to make sure that the sustainable economic growth, how do we make sure that the material, the mines, and the commodities that we have can actually be liberated in order for us to make sure that we're able to trade much, much better.
We are going to a short ad break. More on opportunities in Africa's logistics sector when we return.
So Mohan, I'm going to bring you in on what Sia has just said. I've come back recently from Washington from the IMF meetings where we spoke about this very topic, and that was Derisking Africa and financing options, innovative financing options that Sia is alluding to, co-financing of projects. And again, as Sia has said, the DBSA coming in and funding the pre-feasibility stage to eliminate the risk for long-term investors. Perhaps you can just elaborate on what you're doing.
I think there are two issues at play. I think the one is there is generally a very large pool of capital out there. The challenge is a lot of it is in dollars, euros, and it's a big challenge to be funding local infrastructure in foreign currency unless you have foreign currency revenues to match that against. And that's been one of the big challenges that we've faced, and I think it's one of the big challenges that a lot of the countries in Africa do face as well. Because while there is a big pool of capital, it would be even better if we can mobilize as much domestic capital as possible, and especially domestic long-term capital. And that is going to require us to increase our savings rate as Africans to the kind of rates that you've seen in China, where they're saving 40% plus of GDP, which is then going directly into investment. You know, all the studies show there's a direct link between investment through to GDP. If you even look at the calculations as an economist, in 101, it's investment is part of that. So that's one element. It is an area where we can improve.
Tami, I want to bring you in here. Another big theme is skills development and sustaining training. Perhaps you can give a little more color around the engineering space and specifically how you are sustaining projects, creating skills transfer from Transnet to operations across Africa?
One key aspect that relates to this issue of funding, it's we're going to have to find a way to reduce the cost of doing business, to make sure that we assist the continent with affordable products. And one of the things we have been doing as Transnet Engineering, we have been re-engineering our wagons and coaches, but most importantly, we have designed and engineered a locomotive which is designed for the African continent. We call it our Trans-African locomotive.
Trans-African locomotive.
Yes, we will be launching it in the next 2 to 3 months. It's currently going through static tests at the moment, and after that we're going to take it to dynamic testing. And it's a locomotive that is light. We're talking about 12 to 15 tons per axle, and it's designed for the African continent in a lot of ways. It's important that we make sure that while there's an issue around funding, that we make sure that we find products that are easily fundable for the continent.
Carl, do you want to comment on the funding aspect? Because I've got another follow-on question.
You know, the game that we're in is to ensure that there's a competent transport infrastructure, so that you can bring together the manufacturers, the producers, the cargo owners with the market that demands that cargo. And we then need to ensure that we facilitate that, we capacitate the transport networks that we are charged with the development of, and to work together with funding institutions like the DBSA to make sure that this takes place. Certainly the market demand strategy has been about that. As an operating entity, as a freight logistics services provider, Transnet is very much involved in the building of a competent network, which is what we've done in South Africa, and we continue to do in South Africa. And what we're now doing is to say that let's develop this even further in the continent, because it's not just about creating the network and creating the facilitation of trade between South Africa and economies elsewhere on the planet, but also making sure that on the African continent itself that we play a meaningful role in developing the transport networks there.
Sia, can you comment a little more on the competitive environment? Who competes with Transnet? And I know sometimes this is a difficult answer, because in some instances you work with the players, and in other instances you compete with them.
Competition is good. Because I think it sharpens everyone in terms of what we ought to do. But I think importantly, if you put your customer at the center, you begin to develop solutions that are required by them. But what we've seen on the continent, we have a lot of competitors who come from outside of the continent. Because certainly although we compete with a number of entities in the continent itself, but we also cooperate on certain aspects, because you have to try and leverage different core competencies that each of the entities have. Our strength lies in rail engineering. Our strength lies in rail operations and port operations. But what we tend to see when you look at the project pipeline is you get a lot of competitors from countries such as China, for instance. The Chinese are coming into the continent with different types of packages. But our view as Transnet is that we should work with different countries in partnership. Our view is that we should work more to actually identify and satisfy identified needs, and work with countries to come up with solutions across and strengthen the value chains through collaboration. So our model is unique. in the sense that, I mean, if you look, for instance, in Mozambique, we compete but also work with Greenrod, for instance. They have certain capabilities that we don't have, and we have certain capabilities that they don't have. And as we strengthen the value chain, it becomes important that the interfaces that we have in terms of port and rail are actually there to make sure that we are giving solutions that are of benefit to the customers themselves. So sometimes we have joint planning facilities, for instance, with our competitors. So they have a window in terms of some of the things that we do.
Carl, how are South Africans perceived on the rest of the continent?
As fellow Africans, I would think. We certainly, in our activity that we do in numerous other African countries outside of South Africa, we've been received warmly. And I mean, I mentioned earlier, Sia mentioned earlier as well, the relationship that we've built now in Benin with the new contract that we signed in Benin with Sobermap, and that is actually growing in leaps and bounds. And we have about 5 of our people that have been stationed now in Cotonou working on that project, and the report backs that we get from them are that, you know, they're very happy. They still have families back in South Africa, so we hope that they won't forget their families in South Africa and have new families in Benin. But certainly I think it's been it has been a very pleasant experience in terms of, you know, the relationships that we've built and we continue to build in other African countries, and we want to deepen that.
The size of Africa works in your favor, because obviously that is why we desperately need the transport, the logistics, the freight. But there's another element, and I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges for the African continent, and that is that 621 million people across Africa do not have access to electricity. So half the continent is in the dark. And if you'll just bear with me for a moment, when I fly over African cities, so Lagos, Kigali, Kinshasa, Nairobi, the list is endless, Kigali. At night, if you look out your window, you see patches of light, and then you just see darkness for as far as you can see. By contrast, having just flown into Washington and London and Los Angeles at night, I was blinded when I looked out of the window, and you just see this pulsating energy of light for as far as you can see. And I think that that is one of Africa's biggest challenges. So, Tami, I know a very elaborate way to intro my next question, but to what extent do power deficits impact your ability to roll out across Africa?
Some of the facilities we want to introduce in the continent, we do heavy engineering, which requires a lot of electricity. But I think our colleagues in the continent, for whom we continue to not only supply rolling stock, we consult as Transnet in terms of assisting, because for us, our interest really is to make sure that goods move from Cape to Cairo on rail, you know. As we continue to consult, we found that they've identified that for now, in the short to medium term, is to focus on using diesel locomotives so that the issues around electricity are bypassed. But for various facilities, including maintenance facilities, we are going to have to come up with solutions to deal with that as a challenge. So it's not such a big impact, and even in terms of the considerations we are making on components and manufacturing that we are planning on doing in other countries, that has been taken into consideration, and we've been working on solutions that make sure that that doesn't become a bottleneck.
Mohan, let's just get your comment here on focusing on power outside of South Africa.
No, I think it's a very good question. I mean, our primary focus as the DBSA, if you look at our sectors, is power. About 50% of our lending goes into energy in terms of generation, transmission, distribution. And there's been a lot of very good initiatives that have been kicked off around solving it. There's the Power Africa initiative that the US government and their entities have. Dr. Adesina, the new president of the AFDB, has made power in Africa his #1 priority as well. So there's a numerous number of initiatives on the go. And I think what's also good is the technologies are also progressing at a very fast pace, especially around renewables. In South Africa as a country, we've been very lucky in having a very good program that's been able to take advantage of that. I mean, I think it's not as well understood, but for instance, already there's 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy that South Africa has either brought to the grid or is in the process of bringing to the grid. Similarly, there's another 6,000 megawatts of baseload power between coal and natural gas that South Africa will be bringing into the grid in the next couple of years as well. And that's the South African story that can very easily be replicated in a lot of other countries as well, which also have these endowments. Mozambique and Tanzania have found very large resources of natural gas. We know the oil and natural gas resources that exist across West Africa. There's a lot of hydrothermal around this part of the continent as well. So there are very, very strong and significant energy resources. Even in Rwanda, for instance, we're launching a project around peat, which is a form of coal. We're working with some private entities to try and get that up and running, which is about an 80 to 120 megawatt project as well.
That brings us to the end of this discussion on prospects and investment opportunities.